Okay, so thank you everybody for joining. If you are in the waiting room right now, we are starting tonight's event. So I'm just going to ask you to hang out in the waiting room and I will let you in. I'm also asking everybody to turn off their video and to remain muted. And I may have to do that for you. Please don't take it personally. So I think we have a great crowd here tonight for Mark Scarbrough and Helen Klein Ross. Many of you may know Mark Scarbrough through one of his many endeavors. He talks about books at most libraries in our area, including Scoville Library. And he also co-authors cookbooks with his husband, Bruce Weinstein, over 30 at last count. And in his spare time, he hosts the podcast, Walking with Dante, The Lyric Life, which is about poetry, and along with Bruce, Cooking with Mark and Bruce. And as you may also know, he is fairly active on social media and hosts some wonderful looking dinner parties. So tonight we're going to hear how he found the time to write a memoir, which is called Bookmarked, How the Great Works of Western Literature Fucked Up My Life. And yes, I did say that word. And in conversation with Mark this evening is Helen Klein Ross of Lakeville. And Helen is a poet and novelist whose work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and in the Iowa Review, where she won the 2014 Iowa Review Award in Poetry. In addition to writing, Helen has had a career as creative director in some of New York's top ad agencies, which led to her podcast about the show Mad Men. And last but not least, Helen was on the library board for many years and brought the library's print image into the 21st century. And I and everyone at the library is eternally grateful for Helen sprucing up our image. So this evening, Mark and Helen are in conversation about the differences between their forms, how narrative changes its rules between novels and memoirs, and how writers negotiate the challenges of presenting something that's realer than true or truer than real. So again, thank you for coming. We've left about 20 minutes at the end of their conversation for your questions. And if you put them in the chat, I will relay them to Mark and Helen when we will do our very best to get all the questions answered. So again, thank you for coming. I'm going to disappear and turn this over to Mark and Helen.
Thank you, Claudia. And I just want to say that it wasn't me who redid your image. A lot had to do with Collab. That's a wonderful ad agency in Hartford, Connecticut. So I am so excited to be here to talk about Bookmarked, which is a memoir, but also the idea of writing a memoir versus writing a novel. And that's really my first question for you, Mark. Aside from, we'll save the question for last, how the heck do you have time to write anything given all the other things that you're juggling? But my first question is, what made you choose this form of the story? Did memoir come naturally to you in unfolding this narrative, or were you tempted, as many people are, to turn your life into fiction?
No, actually, to be honest with you, Bookmarked did not start as a memoir. It started as an attempt at a novel. And if you've read the book or you know anything about my life, you might know that I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian family. And as a teenager, I preached the rodeo and county fair circuit in Texas. And so I started out trying to write a novel about a gay kid, gay pre-adolescent, gay adolescent kid, a rodeo preacher, etc. And I couldn't make it work. I could only make it come out in fragments. So, and just chapter fragments that didn't actually cohere in any way. And I couldn't figure out how to get the development of the character. So being ever stubborn, I swapped it from a third person narrative to a first person narrative. And I decided I was going to write a first person narrative novel, an I novel. And I tried that and I still couldn't make it work. I couldn't make the character work. And I kept feeling as if, especially the main character, I think his name was Alex in the novel, I kept trying to connect with Alex and I couldn't make the connection happen. And so finally, after much torture, I changed it around to a memoir. And once I changed it around to a memoir, I can't tell you that it flowed. It did not flow out of me. I had to figure out a different way to write as a memoirist. And that was one of the toughest assignments of writing Bookmarked, is figuring out how to write it. And exactly, I thought I knew something about writing novels. It turns out I knew little about writing novels, and I knew almost nothing about writing a memoir. I kind of had to stub my toes 1,000 times to make it happen. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, that answers that question very well. So I guess as a fiction writer, the thought of writing memoir is pretty scary. Was it scary for you? And if so, what was the scariest part?
The scariest part was, as I've said, I said a billion times to people who watched me go through this process, was that I thought that I had been brave, and I thought that I had been as brave as I could possibly be revealing myself. And I realized I had to be braver and braver and braver. And I had to get to the point where I told a story that had an arc to it, but that was also emotionally connected to me. The only way I can put this is that in writing the memoir, I had to find the place where the voice lived in my body. It had to actually feel like the voice came out of my body, not out of my head. And in working through that, because I told my husband this, we were talking about it the other day in the car, and I said, when I first started writing it as a memoir, my whole goal was to prove to everyone who read it how smart I was and how clever I was and how many, Emily Dickinson quotes I could weave into one paragraph, and, and subtly how much George Eliot could I get into one paragraph that, only really smart readers would get. And all the time I had to, and this was really hard, I had to lose the notion that the purpose of the book is to prove how clever I am, and gain the notion that the purpose of the book is to tell a story. And that was, believe it or not, a challenge for me. It proved a 4-year challenge in the process that it took, because I had to finally realize, maybe I can direct this back to you, Helen, I had to finally get to the point where story was first. And it was hard because it's about me. And I know, a memoir, you can't write about every detail of your life. You can't write about the time, you did X, Y, and Z, because it's not relevant to the topic that I'm writing about, which was the effects of great literature on me and the psychotic break I underwent after I read too much. So I'm not writing every detail of my life, but I'm still having to condense it, and I'm still in the end having to fall on the story. So let me ask you this, Helen.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add, so Abigail Thomas, do you know her work? She's written a bunch of memoirs. She's an amazing memoirist. And she said the hardest part of writing story is figuring out what to leave out. And that's probably true of both fiction and memoir, right?
Yeah. So do you think that that's true of you as a novelist? Is it true for you that?
Yes, absolutely. Because you have this dream of a story. I've been writing stories set in the distant past. And so I do a lot of research, and I go down the rabbit hole, and there's so many interesting facts that I want to include in the story. And my first draft is so baggy. It's got all this crap in it that doesn't need to be there. And so then, the second attempt is trying to figure, okay, what's the narrative? What's the story? What's the story that's going to be pulling people along? And even a really interesting fact, did you guys know in 1911, the headlines all over New York were 9/11 will be a day that lives in infamy, because on September 11th, in I think it was 1905 or 11, an L train fell off its tracks as it was rounding a corner up in the Upper West Side, and people were falling out of the cars. And so 9/11 became this day that was associated with terrible things back in the day.
Absolutely.
But you can't possibly cram everything, every interesting fact that you find as a fiction writer into your story. So yeah.
Yeah, when I was having, especially in the final draft stages of my memoir, Bookmarked, I was having to cut stuff. And by that point, I was cutting down toward the bone, as they say. And it was killing me because, again, I was having to pull out the paragraph with the 8 Emily Dickinson quotes in it. And I have to say that I saved them all in a file on my computer. So I have them all still. I couldn't just disappear them. I was so...
Your next memoir, or that's for your novel, or that's for your whatever, your next cookbook. It can be used. Yeah, Plath apparently never threw away anything. And Ted Hughes sort of looked down on her for that because he tossed everything apparently, but Sylvia Plath saved everything, and she got to use it.
What? Ted Hughes looked down on Sylvia Plath? What?
I've heard, yeah.
So let me ask you, because what I just said about memoir is bringing the character of me in the memoir closer and closer to me, and trying to find the place where that character lives inside my body. Do you find you have a similar reaction to character in novel, or do you find that you need a little distance on your characters in your novel? Does that make any sense?
That's a good, yeah, that's a good question. No, I need to be the character. Just like you need to be you. I mean, the you that is in this book isn't the you that will be in your next book, or isn't the you that will be in fiction, perhaps, because I think writing a book, the act of writing a book, changes you. When you're writing a character, you have to be that character, I think. Otherwise, the character is going to be flat, or you're going to come off like you're judging the character. So even a character that does heinous things doesn't feel him or herself to be a monster. So the writer, I think, has to inhabit the consciousness of that character in order to write something that feels true, and in order to write a character that readers will follow.
Yeah, because you and I are talking obliquely and indirectly about, in another world, about Middlemarch, and part of Middlemarch is the story of the narrator falling in love with her main character, Dorothea Brooke, who she clearly hates at the opening of the novel.
I know. I was just going to say, yes. So I went to lunch with a friend after your Middlemarch lecture on, when was it, Tuesday? And we both said we read Middlemarch earlier, when we were young, and we thought Casaubon was an absolute monster. But this time we have much more empathy for him, and we understand Eliot's empathy. In fact, at a certain point, Eliot comes right out and says she feels sorry for him. That's in the text of the novel, right? So yeah,
but I don't think that a modern novelist such as you don't have the luxury to allow that development to happen like a Victorian novelist does, where she's basically writing it partially as she's publishing it in installments, and so we can actually watch her change toward her characters. As a modern novelist, you probably have to have that feeling of inhabiting the characters from the opening get-go. Well, not the opening get-go, but it has to be from the get-go of the novel once it's published. Is that fair?
I forgot. Oh my God, what a luxury. Can you imagine a world in which a novelist would publish a few chapters at a time? Book one comes out the next year. Book 2, everyone's talking about it. Can't wait for book 2 of Middlemarch. It's just astounding now to think that world of literature could have existed. But
yeah, it did exist. And the world of memoir, as we now see it in our world, didn't exist back then, because memoir is such now as it's practiced. I mean, they practiced a form of autobiography, which was much more formal and much more staid.
Talk about the difference between autobiography, memoir, autofiction, or is there one?
Sure. I think that for me, autobiography is a more staged presence. I think about the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, or I think about the education of Henry Adams, these big 19th century autobiographies, and they're very staged, or Elizabeth Cady Stanton's 80 Years and More. Again, it's this very staged feel in which you're bringing yourself out as character onto a proscenium and talking to an audience. In modern memoir, which is different from autobiography, I think that the big difference, if I had to quantify it, is that modern autobiography is a modern memoir is a thrust stage, not a proscenium. Like it's the stage that's thrust out into the center of the audience and the actors walk out into the middle of the audience. And you have to, as a modern memoirist, figure out how to walk and inhabit that stage that actually is part of the audience. And that means connecting with your audience. It doesn't mean an autobiography, since it's so proscenium directed, is about staging my life so that you know what happened to me and how I became the great orator Frederick Douglass, or yada yada yada, or how I became Elizabeth Cady Stanton and my role in women's liberation. And a modern memoirist like Mary Carr, or even like Bookmark, you're trying to push out into the thrust stage, and by doing that you're identifying with your audience. You're trying to pull connections to your audience, to your story. I think when I was writing Bookmark, I was very conscious of the fact that everybody has stories in their head that they have to jettison. Everybody adopts stories from their parents, their siblings, their spouses, whatever. Mine happened to come out of the great works of Western literature that overran my mind, and I adopted them as my narratives until I finally tried to turn my life into a Henry James novel. And mine was much more about taking on these stories, but I was very conscious of, while I was writing it, that I had to show that we all have this experience together. We know what it's like to be told a story of who you are and have to jettison it in some fundamental way and have to find out how to write your own story. I think that's part of the difference between autobiography and memoir.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
Yeah. And so just for my own edification, what the heck is autofiction?
Oh, autofiction is such a modern term, and it's like Ayat Akhtar's Homeland Elegies. It's this kind of median spot in which you're not really writing your memoir, you're fictionalizing your life. And I fought it for a long time, because part of the ethics of my memoir is I was telling some very private and intimate things in Bookmark that involved people who are still alive. And it says, as it says in the book, all their names are changed because I didn't ask them if they wanted to be a part of this memoir, because many of them are dead at this point, of the characters in that book. And I didn't go out and ask any of them, do you want to be inside this book? The one exception to that is my husband, Bruce, who is named Bruce in the book. And there were two reasons for that. One is because Bruce and I have a relatively public career as cookbook authors. So it would seem very, very funky for me to rename him Randy or Bill when I publish cookbooks with this guy named Bruce. And it's clear that this is my husband, and that we go on shows together, and we go on the Today Show together and all that as a couple. Some go to QVC as a couple. So it would seem very odd. And I have to say that after I had turned the first draft in, our literary agent invited us into dinner in New York. And I kind of thought she was gonna congratulate me for being so heroic about trying to write my life story. And instead, she really wanted to know if Bruce was okay being in the story. And it was okay if I went off and did this thing on my own over here. And furthermore, is it okay that he's going to tell things about you along the way? Because there are pieces of it where Bruce doesn't come off flatteringly.
Well, what I think is irrelevant to what Bruce thinks, but that really brings me to kind of a basic question that everybody asks or wonders about memoir. Do you have a moral compass that you follow? Since I'm friends with you both, I was wondering, like, wow, how does Bruce feel about this? And I love the chapter that you devote to that. But what if he hadn't gone along with it? What if he had resisted? What would you have done?
Maybe I would have gone back to that turgid third-person novel that I tried to write.
Well, I'm glad that he went along with it then.
I'm not quite sure what I would have done had he said no. Bruce is astoundingly supportive of the things that are in my life, and he has always been this person who is unbelievably interested in supporting whatever I do, from the teaching of Middlemarch to running a Dante podcast to writing this memoir. So I actually, maybe I'm taking him for granted, but I didn't think he would say no. But he could have, and I think I probably would have backed off.
You seem pretty nervous in the chapter.
Yeah, well, I am. You know,
it was good suspense. It was good storytelling because the reader doesn't know. Like, well, I guess the reader would jump to the conclusion that the book's been published. So unless you guys got divorced, he probably was on board.
Yeah, that chapter is a strange chapter, because in the middle of that, part of what the book is, Bookmarked, is about, is being an adopted kid and not fitting onto the timeline I was adopted onto as a kid. And so once I started reading books, I started realizing that there were millions of timelines, billions of timelines, a timeline in every plot, and that maybe there was a timeline out there where I could be me, and that would look like me, since I go through my life as an adopted kid and no one in my whole world looks like me, right? No, I don't have a single family member who looks like me. Nobody looks like me in my life. And so I start this journey to try to find myself in other plots. And in that chapter, Bookmark, in which I hand Bruce the manuscript, the draft of the manuscript, is the same, and it was the same moment in which he hands me a file out of his file, which I still to this day have no idea how it got there, in which there are the original lawyer documents of my adoption. And somehow he hands me that file as I hand him the manuscript, which seems so staged, and yet it's exactly what happened that day. And so he gives me this file, and I don't pay attention to it. He goes upstairs with my manuscript. I get angry at him because I'm like, he's cleaning his office, or he's not reading it, or whatever. And then later he comes down, and I open the file and I see the original lawyer letter of my adoption, and it's kind of a crazy moment. And yet he's been reading my memoir, which is about being an adopted kid.
Crazy. As a reader, that was the difference between fiction and nonfiction, I thought, because if you were writing fiction, it would be unbelievable. It was too unbelievable that as you hand the novel or your book, he hands you this very momentous stack of papers. But it works because I know what happened. It's a memoir. And it was a very powerful part of the book, I thought. And also the way you handled, you dedicate the book for her or to her. And of course, a reader wonders, who's the her? Is it Miranda? Is it going to be Polly? Is it? And then you find out at the end who it is. And I thought that was beautifully handled.
It's my birth mother. And at the end of the book, that's right, the book basically ends with a dinner party sequence in which I imagine my birth mother at the dinner party, and what would she be feeling,
and seeing,
and what would she think of me,
what would she think of you? But she's there. This is almost a letter to your birth mother, like sort of like Ocean wrote to his mother. You're not writing to your mother at all, of course, but it's just a beautiful passage. Wait, let me just see where yeah. I knew I'd written this book for her. She's here, the presence, not the silence, between all the words. I thought that was beautiful. It was really
Thank you. I just finished recording the audio book for Bookmark, which will be out in second week of November. And I got the privilege of reading the book myself and being my own reader of my own book, which was astounding. And there's a couple moments during the recording of the audio in which I broke down in the booth. And I started to cry, which was crazy. Sitting in a booth for 5 days, reading my own book into a microphone felt like the end of the process.
Wow.
It felt like the end of the process more than the published book. It felt like this thing had happened. And so I broke down at one point, there's a line in the book about being an adopted kid and that no mother's milk has ever let down at the sound of my voice. And that I don't have this fundamental connection with any human. And I broke down in the booth when I got to that line, and I apologized to my director, and I said, I'm really sorry, you know, like, we can take this at the beginning of the paragraph again. And he said to me, no, this is gold. We're keeping this in. This is so in the audiobook. This is the gold we were hoping for. And I thought, oh,
You're the
see,
writer. Yeah, you
yeah, I
feel,
know, but
an
you have
actor
to be,
could never, even a, you know, the best voice actor could never have done that.
but
And
it's that you have to be brave, and then you have to be braver. And I think maybe that's one of the ways that fiction and memoir actually meet, right? Because you realize as a writer of narrative that you have to go the place the story goes. And if you shy away, it starts to feel false. I'm sure you feel this about characters in your novels.
yeah,
Is
I
that
mean,
fair?
yeah, absolutely. And wherever whatever the characters are doing, you're doing. So yeah, I've been living in 1930s Germany for a few years, and yeah, it doesn't
Oh.
feel very good at all. I can't wait to leave that world. But yeah, you're taken. It's like a story takes you. You don't usually just sort of sit there and think up stories. They sort of grab you, and then you're off, and you have to stick with it until it's finished. Just like you had to stick with your own life until you came to the very end.
Right. And sometimes being brave is shying away from, how do I say, saying the worst. It's not necessarily brave to say the worst about a character nor yourself in a memoir. It's, you have to get closer to the bone. I keep coming back to this metaphor for me, but I kept having to figure out where it was in my body. And where did the voice arise in my body? At literally locating it inside
Yeah,
my
yeah,
body.
yeah.
And
Well,
also when I felt something as a teenager or as a 20-year-old, where did that sit inside my body?
that's so interesting. Yeah, because when I'm writing fiction, there's actually a story compass, like right about here. And when the story goes wrong, the story compass goes dead. So when I feel it's puffing along, then that it's like tick, 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 tick. And then you know when you've gone down the wrong road because you're not feeling anything. So that's very interesting that you say it's a physical process as well as a
It
mental.
is.
Yeah.
It is a total physical process. And for me, it involves locating the voice in my body. It involves playing music very, very loudly as I
Oh
write.
my
Poor
God,
Bruce.
I could
Poor
never
Bruce
do
has had
that.
to endure giant, loud music the whole time I'm trying to
Poor
write.
Bruce. Oh my
Poor
God.
Bruce. And I have a penchant for very polyrhythmic, atonal postmodern music. So he's had to listen to basically spoons dropping in the silverware drawer for about 2 years as the memoir was reaching its end. But for me, that's all part of the music. Actually helps me, like your fiction compass. The music helps me to make sure, as I feel the vibrations in my body, that I'm keeping the text in my body. I have just this huge tendency to pull it up into my head and to want it to live up into my head. Again, wanting to prove how clever I am, rather than to tell a story that can resonate on a thrust stage with a reader.
Telling the story, not trying to prove how smart you are or not trying to get even with someone, or that's great advice. And I know there's a lot of writers on this call. So I'm going to ask you, like, what advice would you give somebody working on their first memoir, or what advice do you wish somebody had given you?
I don't know that I have any advice for what anyone had given me, because I actually think that probably in the end, all the processes are individual. So I know that sounds like a cop-out, and I don't mean it to be. I'm coming around to the advice, but I don't know that I wish that anybody had told me anything. Also, I'm a kind of rebellious guy. So if you told me what to do, I would tend to go the opposite way 9 times out of 10. But at the same time, what if someone were writing a memoir? Well, I taught a memoir writing class while I was writing Bookmarked. I taught it through the Norfolk, Connecticut Library. And there may be some people in this room who were in that class. And what I kept trying to get them to come back to is that you're not writing about what happened to you. You're writing about why it happened to you. And mostly you're trying to make your life live in my head. And that's, you're trying to get me to borrow your consciousness. And that is not borrow the things that happened to you. Not, you have to be thinking, I know it sounds very heady, but you have to be thinking about how you can help your reader put on who you are. So I was on a podcast interview yesterday or 2 days ago, and the woman was very into Bookmark and had read it, and she was very into it. And she said to me, "This book is basically chaos that resolves into domesticity." And I said, "Yes, that's right. You got the book exactly.
Good. Yeah.
You exactly got what the book is about and how the book operates on the page." But that indicated to me that I had helped her borrow my consciousness and feel that chaos and feel it calm down to a kind of quiet domesticity. And I think that's it. You see people start off on their first memoir and they start to write about the things that happened to them, which is, obviously that's got to be in there. But but it's always more about showing me when it works. It's about showing me the shape of what you felt like when you felt it. I'm thinking right now, Helen, of a book you and I both know, of David Small's Stitches. And I'm thinking about the way that it's a graphic memoir, but the way that Small allows me to feel what he felt as a kid for the horrible things that happened to him. Now, this is a graphic memoir, and there's those 4 pages or something where it's just pictures of rain for 4 pages. But
yeah.
I'm being
beautifully done. Yes.
I'm being pulled into the shape of his consciousness.
Yeah,
yes.
the perspectives are from a little kid's perspective. So you're looking up the nose of a grandmother, or you're looking, I think consciousness is really everything. That's what art takes over your consciousness, like books do. No art. You can stand in front of a painting and the painting's not going to take you over as a book does for days and days. And that's a part about writing historical too. Like you have to remember, like I remember when I was writing the Latecomers, I got really, this library, Scoville Memorial Library, has old newspapers. And it's a project that was done with the Salisbury Association. So you can read newspapers of the area that date back to 1905. And in 1912, there was a headline about a meeting around airplanes. And men met at this meeting and decided that airplanes would make wars disappear. And it would also make countries disappear. So they were trying to grapple with this. So that consciousness you could never imagine, in another, the town historian, Catherine Chilcott, hooked me up with a diary written by a 15-year-old girl who said, in our class, there are more antis than suffragists. And the thought that young women would choose not to give themselves the right to vote was just inconceivable to this writer 100 years later. So it's like forming the consciousness.
I think that's what I mean by giving the reader a notion of the shape of your consciousness, because it's not what you as in Bookmarked, it's the same that you're describing for a novel. It's not what do I in 2021 think about what I did in 1971 when I preached the fundamentalist rodeo circuit as a kid. It's not about what do I now think about that. It's what did that 11-year-old, and it's imagining myself back in that 11-year-old spot. What did I think about it then? How did I feel? Not, I could have a million snarky, funny, smarty pants psychological assessments of me doing that now. That has, what I need to do is show that kid there. And what was obsessing me is that I was standing at the edge of a tent in the pouring rain, and I was wearing 4-inch disco shoes, which I lied to my mother and told her that they were just normal slip-ons, when in fact I'd seen them on Soul Train, and got her to buy them for me. Soul Train, and got her to buy them. And I was obsessed with the fact that they were going to get muddy, and that the white stitching in the black leather was going to get ruined, and that I was going to get in trouble for it.
Yes, that's perfect. Yeah.
That's what I was obsessed with. And that's how I was trying to hold my feet back from the drip line of the tent and all that kind of stuff. I just finished reading, and if anybody's here that likes this, I'm sorry to kick it. I'm about to kick it. I just finished reading Shuggie Bain, that won the Booker, the autofiction by Douglas Stewart. And I had to say that I didn't like it. And one of the reasons I didn't like it is I didn't think that Stewart did a good job of centering the consciousness in the 11-year-old kid who's trying to care for his alcoholic mother. He, for example, several times, the part that really irritated me is when this 11-year-old kid says, my mother was lying off the sofa. She looked like she was being tortured on a Catherine wheel. And I thought to myself as I read it, no 11-year-old in council flat housing in Glasgow, Scotland is going to know what a Catherine wheel is. It's just, it's not, that's not real. That's the writer being smart about, you know, knowing how St. Catherine was tortured and all that kind of stuff. Maybe knowing about fireworks, except he said tortured on a Catherine wheel. So it just, or another time he said, my mother tried to tidy her life up like a narrative. And it really irritated me because I thought, no, this 11-year-old kid would think my mother tried to tidy her life up like a dresser drawer, or like a kitchen cabinet, or like a kitchen sink full of dishes, or
I mean, on the opposite end of that is Angela's Ashes. Frank McCourt also writing from the perspective of an 11-year-old with all these kind of amazingly true analogies that a kid, you know, is just I think a masterpiece of how an 11-year-old kid deals with trauma and views trauma.
Yeah, and again, I think that for if someone were starting a memoir, you should do some work about figuring out, let's say, I don't know, let's say you had a traumatic car wreck when you were 9. You should do some work about what did it feel like to be in that car wreck at 9. Not what you think about it now, not, you know, my dad was driving too fast, or yeah. What were you doing? Which is probably like, you know, teasing the dog in the back of the station wagon or something, you know, and
because there's no seatbelt. So you're like, you can be in physical fights with siblings. So Mark, I'm looking at the time and I'm wondering if anybody has any questions. And I think what Claudia said is, oh, hooray, Helen, that's my sister from Hawaii. Hi, Catherine. If anybody has any questions about writing fiction versus nonfiction, or questions for Mark about his new memoir, or anything, you can just put them in the chat. Is that right, Claudia?
Yeah, so if you put your questions in the chat, then we still have people coming in, believe it or not. But if you put questions in the chat, I will relay them to Mark and Helen, and they will do their very best to answer them for you.
Let's do, while those questions drop, Helen, why don't what are you working on right now? And we'll let those questions drop. What are you working on?
So I'm working on a novel set in 1930s Germany about a family split by political differences. And there's a baby, as there is in all my books, apparently, who is born in Hitler's Germany, but raised in New York, never knowing her true birth mother, sort of like in your novel, in Bookmarked, how that affects things. So yeah, so I've been living in Nazi Germany for a while, which has been, so I can't wait. I'm already on to my next, you know, I don't know if you agree. I think there's several stages to writing a book or a novel. Like the first stage is like, you see this bright star in the sky and it looks so shiny and you're going to achieve it. You know, it's hard, but you're going to do it. And then you begin to write it and it's so much work and you realize it's not a star, maybe it's like a planet. And then in the third stage, you're writing and you're slogging and it's just like, oh my God, it's not even up there. It's like a top of the mountain. And then the fourth stage is, it's just like a dull rock at your feet that has rolled down from the mountain. But now you see a star that's truly a star, and that's your next book.
Oh, I see. Oh, nice. Exactly.
So as a writer, you know, you're never not miserable, I think, no matter what. Am I right, Mark?
You're always trying to find the next thing to write, and you're always thinking about the next thing to write, because in the end, centering, whether it's that fiction compass that you spoke about, or whether it's centering the voice in the body that I spoke about, either way, it's a dopamine rush is what it is. And you get addicted to that dopamine rush and you want it. You know when it's right, just like marathon runners, you know when it's right. And you can feel it and you kind of want it again. You know, marathon is torture, and yet you want it again. Okay, so Claudia, do we have any questions?
We do. We have a couple of questions. So one question is, you know, the title of the book is How the Great Works of Western Literature Fucked Up Your Life. And I'm wondering if you could talk about a little bit, I don't want you to give away your whole book, but how exactly that was became the title and what happened there?
That's a great.
Well, thank you. This is subtitle, but I wanted it to be the subtitle very badly. And how it got to be that is that, I don't know, it's exactly what I wanted the book to say, which is what it does in fact say. How it happened is that problem of finding yourself in a million plots and none of them fit. I think is at one point in the book, I talk about how once I started reading, and I should say that my introduction to reading is not through the great works of Western literature, but the first book I read is The Stepford Wives in the Memoir. And that is my first introduction to reading. And I talk about how reading felt as fake as my own life, that it felt like something that I was reading about that was happening to other people. And when I quit reading it, it felt just like my life, which was something that was happening to other people. And that I was just as fake on this timeline as I was on that timeline. And eventually that led to me, it's a whole story, but it led to me spending the night with the poet William Blake and having a bit of a psychotic breakdown and finding myself dancing with the prophet Isaiah in my underwear to the Rolling Stones. So you just kind of have to watch those tripwires. They're everywhere.
Okay, I don't think I'm going to ask you about any more inspiration for that night, just to keep things
okay
on the safe side. But
okay.
So now, do you think structure is important in memoir?
Oh, in memoir, yes. In fact, I think structure is crucial. I think of both novels, it's how I think. I think of novels and memoir as pieces of architecture. And I think of them as structurally sound or not. And you have to build structure, and the way you build structure is through story. And yes, absolutely. I think that if you don't build structure into memoir, that means that you're going to basically be trying to write a diary, which is fine. And a lot of people should probably write diaries and pass them on to their children and, you know, the kind of details of their lives. But that's not a memoir. A memoir has to settle down into something like Lucy Greeley's An Autobiography of a Face. If you remember that old memoir from years and years ago, and the horrible cancer surgery she survived and the rebuilding of her face. Many things clearly happened to Lucy Greeley besides the cancer on her face and the cancer that ate away half of her face. But the memoir has to be structured to that story. It has to go into that story and sit right there. It's not how Lucy Greeley did her wash or, you know, what car Lucy Greeley bought. It's instead, unless that's relevant to the problem of not having half a face, then it suddenly becomes relevant. You know, going to a car salesman and being embarrassed about the way you look, then suddenly it's relevant. So I think all of that is the structure, and your life, unlike a novel, your life does dictate the structure of your memoir. but it doesn't necessarily dictate, how do I say this? It's going to seem funky. It dictates the structure of your memoir, but it doesn't necessarily dictate the plot of your memoir. And by plot, I mean the attempt to draw the reader to the next scene. That has to be constructed to draw the reader to the next scene.
Great.
Can I say one of the books that I really find helpful is Thinking About Memoir by Abigail Thomas. It says a lot of what Mark just said, and it talks about a lot about structure, and I don't know, I find it very helpful, even writing fiction. So just
You're still writing genre. Even when you're writing memoir, you're still writing comedy, tragedy, romance. You're still writing genre. Even when you're writing, I mean, I was very conscious of the fact that I was writing comedy, that I was writing a memoir where things pay off in the end.
I thought of your memoir as more of a quest story, you know, a boy's quest for home. It seemed to me to fit into that, my idea of genre narrative. But it was a memoir, of course. So structure, I think structure is one of the most important things of writing a book. Because a book is a thing.
I mean, that's an interesting comment in that the reader takes what the reader takes, whether it's the author's intent or not, you know, how you each see the structure of the novel or the memoir differently. And this is another question that I think would apply to both of you. People talk a lot about narrative voice. Is that a thing that you tend to choose, or something that you find comes over time as you're telling the story?
I'm going to let you go first, Helen.
That's a great question, and it's a super hard challenge. I think when you're first beginning to write, that's the hardest thing to acquire, is your voice, a voice that is you, because in the beginning you're so imitative. You read things that you want to write, and so you might try to sound like Nabokov or Plath, or so it takes years to sort of develop a voice, I think, that is all your own. But it is very important. All of the books that we love in part because of the narrative voice.
And this is going to sound really funky and weird, and it's going to sound a little bit contrived, but you can practice that voice. You can practice the narrative voice that you want around others at dinner parties, and I'm not saying that you have to sit there and rehearse your
Mark
novel.
can practice it. Maybe not everyone can.
Rehearse your memoir. No, but I mean, you can watch yourself and see, you can know exactly when you're being performative and when you're being real. And it's a autobiography compass, as Helen's fiction compass, and you know exactly when you're being performative, and you know exactly when you're being honest and real. And if you can just hit those parts, you can see yourself practicing voice, and right there, that's where you want to live. You want to live right there at that moment where the performative drops and you say something real.
So the way Grace Paley got her start is voice. She had voices in her head of her aunts and uncles and people in the neighborhood, and she started to write stories. And one of her neighbors was an editor at a really good publishing house, and he said, if you can give me pages with this voice. And she said, but I don't know the stories. He said, I don't care about the story, just give me that voice. And so her voice is, her voice. And that's how she discovered it. But really, her voice is what sold her body of work and who made her body of work.
So there are two questions here that to me seem a little bit similar. One of them is, were there parts of the memoir, this is for Mark, that you had written out before more than once, perhaps, maybe as a journal or just thinking about things, and then now I completely lost the question that I thought was similar, but so we'll just leave it at that. I think, and I think that would apply to Helen
Yes,
as well, where you're, thinking of what this voice might be like before you actually create the character.
Yes, there. One of the drafts of my memoir, and it's not a draft that I knew could go anywhere, but one of the drafts of my memoir was literally a how-to manual of how to live my life, and I literally wrote it to me. I wrote it in the second person. You do this. You do this. Next day you'll do this. You'll say this. This next day you'll be this. And pieces of that are still in Bookmark. There are chapters that are written in the how-to voice.
I wondered about that.
And it
Oh,
was this attempt of mine to write. Honestly, to be dead honest, I was copying Lori Moore and How to Be a Writer and How to Get a Divorce and those early stories from self-help. So I thought, oh, I'm just going to write a how-to manual as if I'm writing it to myself, how to live your life. And so I wrote this thing out, like step 1, do this, step 2, do this, step 3, do this. You'll go here, you'll say this. And those pieces got jettisoned, and then over time, some of them got brought back into the book, and now they exist as these weird how-to chapters.
The one that I loved was how to cook a rabbit dinner, how to cook a rabbit. And it's interspersed with doubts about the new boyfriend. And should I really be cooking naked? But no, the pot would splatter all over me. God damn, he better not think I should be cooking this. It was just so, but I wanted to ask you, that was one of my questions that I forgot. So is that recipe real? Is that?
Yeah, I did. I moved in with Bruce on breakfast of Yom Kippur, and I was so idiotic that I stopped at a supermarket and I bought rabbits to make on Yom Kippur. I bought treif, and so I bring treif to the house, to his apartment, and I made rabbit stew, and it was ridiculous that here I am moving in with this guy and I'm cooking him treif on a holiday.
Or maybe not everybody knows what treif is. Treif is
forbidden food.
That's
forbidden
not
food.
kosher. It's
Right.
not kosher for Jewish holidays. So
right.
a guest
And
would never bring treif to a meal.
And I'm panicked about making this for him. So I wrote out a recipe. You could follow that recipe if you'd like and make rabbit and fennel stew anytime you'd like.
Okay,
And I wrote out this recipe and I inserted the stream of my consciousness into it about, like, how come all the pots are out of my reach, and how come is this my kitchen now, or is it his kitchen, and who cleans it? And it was this whole kind of psychodrama.
Transportation of consciousness using a recipe. Actually, I see a writer's on this call, Elizabeth Ehrlich, who wrote a beautiful memoir of recipes. And it's a memoir, and all of her recipes are real too. It's Miriam's Kitchen, it's called. It's a beautiful memoir.
Nice. Yeah,
recipes are real too. I love that when recipes. I love that part of your book.
Sure. Maybe there's a whole genre of stream of consciousness recipes that can exist somewhere.
So I think this is the question that I was trying to link to the other question, and I didn't quite get there, but it has to do with the ending. So, I think this is not an uncommon question for writers is, do you know the ending before you begin? Can that even happen in a memoir? And I think most of us who read a lot have found books that are really great, and then the ending just kind of doesn't work. So how do you work with the ending in each of the ways that you write?
Well, I find somebody once gave me the advice, after you have a manuscript and it's been reworked and worked, lop off the beginning and lop off the ending, and you've got your book. For me, the endings always work that way. I tend to write past the ending, but then my story compass stops ticking. And so I back up the book, chapter, take off that chapter, take off that, until the story compass starts up again. And then I know that's the ending. I tend to write endings that some people find frustrating. Like, why did you end here? It should have gone on. But when I brought it on, it didn't feel right to me. So yeah, everybody. Like, did you know you were going to end your novel in today? Or sorry,
my memoir? Yes, kind of. I mean, it's a little bit of course, it's always false with memoir because you hope that you're still living when you finish writing it. So you're writing the end of a story, but you're going on and doing other things with your life. And of course, there is a falsity about bringing it to an end. But yes, I knew that the core of my story was finally being able to fall in love and call a place home. And that I knew that that occurred with Bruce. It's the only time it's ever occurred in my life.
Hmm.
And because I've always been searching for a home and searching for this place where I belong, I knew that I had to end it there because it's the absolute truth that being with Bruce feels the most like home of any place I've ever been in my life. And so, yeah, I think I say at one point in the memoir that, you know, we scrape the cosmos for signs and answers, trying to divine our fates in stars that have probably long since flamed out. But in the end, most of us are just looking for a love story, and we're just looking for that thing that we can walk down a street and see somebody, and that we can meet, and that we can fall in love, and that we can create a home together. And it all of that, the chaos of being who I was and the craziness of spending the night with William Blake and all, it finally, it all finally just comes down to the fact that I feel at home with Bruce. And so I knew that I wanted to get there. And because I knew in my own life, it's the only place I've ever truly felt at home. And so I guess I did know the ending before I wrote it. I didn't know a lot of the middle parts. I mean, I didn't know how I was going to get there. I didn't know how I was going to tell it. And my memoir is childhood heavy. It's childhood, adolescent, and 20 heavy. And then picks up a great deal of speed once I hit Bruce, because my life stops being about the great books and I get rid of all the great books and I stop being an academic and I throw them all out. And since this is a memoir about what the great books did to me, one would expect the speed to pick up at that point, because now I'm outside of them. It's totally ironic that I threw away every book as an academic I ever owned and ended up in a publishing career in publishing. It's just so ironically insane that here I lived my life through books, and that then I moved to Litchfield County, and as just behind me, books roared back into my life, and now books overwhelm my life again. So it's all very ironic, but at the same time, the truth of the matter was the feeling of home. And where is that feeling going to get located? And it's with Bruce.
Well, that is almost a tearjerker ending, but I'm not going to end it there. So it's very, I mean, it's very heartfelt. It's very sweet. I also see that in all your talking about books in the libraries and beyond, that you have gone back to the great books, it seems to me, as well as contemporary fiction. And I know we've had some questions, and I think anybody who reads always wants to know. So what are some great books that you are reading now? And I'll give that to each of you. And I think that'll be our last question, if that's okay with you.
I'll give it to you, Helen. I'm thinking.
I'm reading right now. I'm reading, you know what, I'm reading several books, just because, you know, why would you just read one book? Who can read just one book at a time? I picked up I was in New York this week, and I picked up at a library a large print copy of somebody I realize has given you a blurb, Will Shalby's memoir. Was it End of Your Life Memoir, or End of Your Life
Book Club,
which is just charming. Talk about a different kind of memoir, but similar in that it also uses books to talk about things that are going on in your life. I'm reading that. I'm also reading from the library, from the Scoville Library, The Magician. Betsy Morey, who I saw was on the call, told me about it. It's Colm Tóibín, writing about Thomas Mann. And a lot of it is set in 1930s Germany. So right now my manuscript is with the agent. She'll send it back with suggestions, I'm sure. So I'm still sort of reading for research, little, you know, details. I'm also reading, because I'm part of Mark's memoir club, book club, Stitches, which is a very interesting graphic novel. And I'm reading Middlemarch because I'm in another one of Mark's seminars. How do you find the time to write? I'm like just blown away.
no.
And
no.
I'm reading one more thing, which is kind of amazing, also from the library, Old Filth by Jane Gardam.
Oh, I
Oh,
love
I
it.
love that book.
Heard of? Oh my God, it's so wonderful.
I love that book. What I'm currently reading is I have just finished Tove Ditlevsen's trilogy memoir, the Copenhagen trilogy. Tove Ditlevsen was probably the most famous writer in Denmark in mid 20th century, and she wrote and published 3 volumes of her memoir. They are extraordinarily grim. They are as Danish grim as one can possibly imagine. As I keep saying, the sentence that just hit me over the head was, "My childhood was long and narrow as a coffin." So it's a difficult memoir about an author who falls into addiction issues. Basically, her husband turns her into an addict, and she is the most published. He basically feeds her Demerol, and she's possibly the most published person in Denmark in the 20th century. So I've been reading that, and I've also been going back and reading more and more old school Katsuo Ishiguro and the early novels of Katsuo Ishiguro, because if you want to know, I think that's probably the next literary seminar I want to do is Katsuo Ishiguro. So I've been reading a lot of Katsuo Ishiguro right now, and reading the old stuff, not just The Remains of the Day, but Artists of the Floating World and those early novels. So that's what I've been reading.
Well, great. Well, thank you both very much. I think this has just been a fabulous way to spend a Wednesday evening. And I really appreciate you sharing your literary pursuits and your creative pursuits. And again, this is Claudia at Scoville Library. This recording will be up on our YouTube channel. So for anybody who has missed this, which does not include everyone who's here, but I'm sure you have friends who couldn't make it, please check it out. And both of their or all of their books are available at the library. I don't think Mark's book is in quite yet, but
And clearly Helen is my publicist. So
yes, she's very good at product placement.
Small percentage. What can I say?
So, but I'm sure both of them would like you to buy their books, but should you choose to borrow them, you will be able to do that at the library. So thank you again very much. This was really wonderful, and good night, everybody.
Thank you. And
Thank
thanks
you.
everybody for coming. Thank you, Mark, for writing Bookmark. Thank you, Claudia, for this one.
Thank you, Helen, for being a part of this, and thanks for being generous enough to be a part of this. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Good night, all.